Hello, and welcome to the Emancipated Citizen Podcast. I'm Benjamin Snow. Zach was not able to make it today, and today I'm interviewing John Junaid, a Rohingya exile and a founder of the Humans in Flight Project and the Archipelago magazine. Hello, John. Would you like to tell us about yourself?
I am originally from Burma, Myanmar, which is in Asia, like Southeast Asia. And I left the country when the military incited a massacre against the minority Rohingya people in Burma, and I belong to Rohingyans. And after fleeing the country, I tried to seek refuge in Australia, traveling, across the country from Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and then finally getting on a boat to Australia. But I couldn't make it to Australia because when we reached the Australian water, we were arrested by the Australian Navy and were sent back to Indonesia. There in Indonesia, we were arrested by the Indonesian local authority and was placed in the detention center. And then from then on, I was trapped in Indonesia for almost like 8 years.
Yeah, it's quite a long time to be in a refugee system, although sadly way too common. I guess the place to start is the background of the Rohingya people. Rohingya live in Burma, a Muslim minority in a predominantly Buddhist country. The military government has been causing problems for a lot of Rohingya people and seem to be trying to drive them out of the country. There was an effort to make Rohingya people sign an agreement not to have more than 2 children when they got married. And there's definitely a lot more that you know about 1,000 times better than me.
Well, we were a group of ethnic people in Burma, and we had lived in our land for generations, for centuries. And we were not, historically, we are not Burmese. We didn't belong to Burma, neither to Bangladesh or any other country. We were a people of in our own land, and the land was called Arakan, and we belonged to that land. But when the British came in to invade the lands, they came through the India and Bangladesh, and my land was connecting between India and Myanmar, the dominant Burmese country. When British came in, we sort of compromised with British to have the British, capture, like, invade Burma because we also wanted to, save our land. But because of that, because we helped the British, the Burmese sort of now resent themselves, against the Rohingyan people that we helped the British to fight to invade Myanmar. But that's back in the history. And the problem right now is that the Burmese government is denying our citizenship because they said we are not a part of Burma. Well, we have been in our own land for centuries, and they said we came from Bangladesh and from Middle East countries. So in 1982, when the military government took over the power, assassinating all the democratic leaders and national hero, including Aung San, who was the one who fought against the British to liberate the country from the occupations. So they also assassinated him, including all his cabinet members, and they amend all the citizenship law. So that was also designed to exclude Rohingya from being the citizen of Burma. So since then, we were denied our citizenship right. So we became illegal immigrants in our own country. And then they implemented strategies to deny our human rights. And we were trapped in our own city. While we were in Myanmar, we were not allowed to travel different countries. We were not allowed to even pursue higher educations, going to different cities. And many people, in my country, many people in my state don't have access to education, don't have access to proper healthcare, don't have access to clean waters, and also even the food and everything were pretty limited, in many remote villages. And a lot of the ongoing human rights violation, it's happening everywhere, and people were being, disappeared, being slaughtered, killed. Like those are like daily stories of Rohingyans. And ever since Rohingya have been living in that land, there was not a day that they didn't face harassment, discriminations, persecutions. So we kind of grew up in this atmosphere, in these circumstances, you know. It was hard to imagine now that I'm in Canada when I compare the situation, the life of human beings, you know, how women's should live on Earth. It's pretty different. Like I can imagine myself right now, like anybody from Canada goes there and live as a Rohingya in Myanmar, do not need to be killed by the military, but they would either die themselves or commit suicide because that's not the way human beings are supposed to live with no basic human right. Even to stay over to a different house, which is even attached to your building, you still need to get military permission as a Rohingya to stay over at your friend place, to stay over at your relatives. And if you want to travel to like 1 hour different village, which is just 1 hour, you need to get permissions. So while I was a student in Myanmar, I went to a study to the university, which is let's say 8 hours far from my city. So all along the way, there were different kind of military checkpoint, and I had to pay to every military checkpoint, you know, to let me pass the gate and go there. And it's not just giving the money. I have to, you know, tolerate a lot of the. They insulted me like a lot all the way, every checkpoints, and they would call me Kala. Why are we going? Kala means like illegal immigrants. You know, what's the point of going to university? You are not from here. You won't get any chance to use your education. You don't belong here. Don't go there. Don't waste your money studying at the university. There was a lot of this kind of discriminations, persecution I had to experience growing up in Myanmar. It's the story of every Rohingya who grew up, you know, in this kind of situations. Like if you, it's not my story. It's every Rohingya story, and everyone, you know, grew up in these situations. Even though, you know, I would say comparatively, I came from a pretty privileged family. Even though I live in, you know, like in a city. City is comparatively safer than the villages. But yet, if I have experienced this thing in my life, even though I live in city, imagine what would happen to people living in the village where there are no any sort of like avenue for them to call for help in this kind of villages. So that's why most of the people that are being killed and disappeared are in village. So in 2017, the pre-planned genocidal attack was in place in 2012 while I was at the university. And it sort of continued from 2012. There was years of planning to genocide the whole community and clean them out from their land. So they implemented that genocidal attack in 2012 when I was in the university. I was doing my major in physics, and I was in my final year. So I couldn't complete my study because of the conflict. I had to leave the country. I escaped to Bangladesh. From Bangladesh to India, and from India to back, Myanmar, and Myanmar back like Yangon, the capital, and from there I flew to Thailand. So yeah, I was able to escape from the genocide, but a lot of them were not. Many, I have lost many of my friends, my families, my relatives. So the genocide continues from 2012, and by 2013, 2014, 2015, it has further escalated, and almost the entire populations of Rohingyas were affected by the genocide, by the, uh, this. So the Burmese named that of killings of Rohingya as an operation to eradicate the rebel fighters in the Arakan state. Well, they were pretty smart. They created themselves a group of fighters in Rakhine State. Actually, many different kind of fighters, and they were all ununiform. I would say ununiform military. They named them as a fighters. That was a kind of excuse for Burmese government to name them as rebel fighter and kill the whole Rohingya people in the name of these fighters, this group, and saying, portraying that we were fighting against these militants who are attacking our government, our sovereignty, and they are terrorists. So by giving them the name of terrorists, they were killing the Rohingyan people. So as I said, it was a very well planned, systematic attack on Rohingyas to to genocide the whole like Rohingya people. So from then on, they have killed more than 100,000, more than at least I would say at least 500,000, and displaced like right now almost like all the Rohingyans cities are now become like green places. There are no more homes there. The whole villages of Rohingyas were burned down, and almost all the cities. Now, majority of them have left the country. They are now, living in Bangladesh camp, which has become the largest refugee camp in the world, with the population of more than 1 million, and they are all Rohingya people from Burma. And the only remaining people would be in Myanmar, I guess, around 500 to 600. Like we have lost the land.
500 to 600 people total, or 500 to 600,000?
500 to 600,000. So like 3.1 millions in the beginning, like almost 1 million, I would say, have killed by the military over the years from time to time. And we then in 2010 there was a research on our populations, and we were estimated to be 1 point something 1 millions remaining populations.
Yeah, that is such an enormous loss of people. And where do you think everyone's going to end up? Do you think eventually everyone in Bangladesh will be given Bangladeshi citizenship? Because I mean, in a country of over 100 million people, 1 million more isn't all that much.
Bangladesh would never ever accept Rohingya for anything. They would not provide them any temporary or local or ground solution for Rohingya people. They are only allowing them to stay in Bangladesh. It's also because of their own interests. Having these refugees in Bangladesh, it's helped Bangladesh in many ways to further their economic interests in many countries. People are now investing in Bangladesh because of this crisis. And a lot of the donations are coming from different countries. And Bangladesh make this refugee crisis as a business to receive donations and find investor in their country. And a lot of the Bangladeshi people who were jobless before now have jobs in refugee camps, in security, in many departments, and many Bangladeshi have now created different organizations and who are all funded by international community and different agency, and all the funds are coming from other country. It's a great marketing for Bangladesh to invest, their interests. So that's the reason why Bangladesh is okay to allow them to stay in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, and that is the reason why they have not, issued any Rohingya to exit from Bangladesh until recently, when they were pressured to open the border for Rohingyans. Like Canada has approached to resettle some Rohingyas from Bangladesh, but the Bangladesh government, did not issue them any exit permits because the Bangladeshi government want to keep them in Bangladesh for their own interests. That's
Oh, good lord.
yeah.
Okay, and Zach is able to join now, everyone.
Yes, apologize. Having some personal difficulties earlier, but
So yeah, that's the Bangladeshi, you know, a standpoint there. And in the first place, it's not that Bangladeshi 100%, the Bangladeshi government 100%, are welcoming to allow Rohingya stay in Bangladesh. It was because their border situation was pretty chaos, right? They didn't have any proper border protections like we have in Canada, like in other countries. So people were able to pretty much cross from, both sides. And then when they are there, they utilize that, for their own interests. And I'm pretty much confident that Bangladesh is not, the government itself is not pretty much, committed to save Rohingya because when you look at the situation in the camp, there is no proper protections happening from Bangladeshi governments. So they were only like they just let them in a place where no human beings would ever want to live. And yeah, so they didn't care because those land are not used by local people. And they thought if somebody can live there, we are gaining benefit from their livings, so why not? It's a kind of business interest there. I would say it's not humanity; it's their own business interest. And a lot of Bangladeshi people are now killing Rohingyas. They have, I would say, it's a current Bangladeshi government is also pretty much collaborating with the military governments in terms of Rohingya issue, and they are also somehow connected to military agenda because the Bangladeshi government was in a place in the first place to kind of like protect Rohingya people, but they never showed any sort of like proper action against Burma. And also, right now, they are not providing any protection to Rohingya people in the camp. And they were maybe, the Bangladeshi governments or maybe the Burmese government have sent a lot of the people from Myanmar to kill Rohingya in Bangladesh. And because of the lack of protections, they are not safe. They are facing another genocide, another massacre in Bangladesh. Every day there were house burning in the camp. There were people being found dead. There were people disappeared. There were children, women are being kidnapped. And the Bangladeshi people are selling them off to prostitutions and to many gangsters for organ sellings. In India they are trafficking them to India, to many countries, stealing Rohingyas, women's and children's from the camp. So there's no a governing body there to protect Rohingyans. If the Bangladesh were like purely assisting Rohingya people on humanitarian base, they would have all this protection in place, and the Rohingya people would not have been facing another genocide in Bangladesh. So I wouldn't say they are pretty much into humanitarians. They're just only in their own business, creating profit from the victims, like using victim for their own interests. That's what I would consider looking at the situation based on the situation. So the solution for Rohingyas in Bangladesh would not be integrating them in Bangladesh because Bangladeshi government would not accept that. On the other hand, they have their own internal issue, like you said, it like huge number of populations within a small land, and it could potentially, create many conflict with the local as well. So Bangladesh is not an option. The ultimate option would be to go back to Myanmar and pressure in the military governments to, secure, safe pathway for them to return to the, Myanmar in their home in Arkan. But that would hardly be possible in the future because now that looking at the political dynamic of the world, it's UN is hardly concentrated in many countries, and United Nations pressure is not enough to impose any sort of pressure on this kind of dictatorial governments, like for example North Korea, and many other countries. So Myanmar is also a part of the this Chinese policy. So China is always backing up Myanmar. So the ultimate solution here would be, to kind of allocate as much resource as possible in Bangladesh and establish a proper security system to protect them from facing another massacre in Bangladesh. And they should have a proper governing system because the people living there are human beings and they have a good number of populations which need to have a proper governance system to for them everyone to be protected, and this could be coordinated, and this is something UN is the right place. UN is the right person, right body to allocate this security system in the camp in coordination with Bangladesh. That's the first thing that they need to do, the international community and the world need to do right now to save them in the camp. And the next thing would be, to resettle some of those that are in need of resettlement to Canada, to all those signatory countries, all those capable countries who can who can accept some of these vulnerable refugees, and they are our students and young Rohingyas who are pretty much interested and capacity to further continue their study. So we need to create an educational pathway for them. For example, finding a scholarship and resettling them to Canada or USA or other countries where they can pursue higher education. And this could be, the future leader of their community, and they would have, once they are educated, they would be able to kind of help their community themselves. One of the reasons why our community is still suffering as a stateless, a humanitarian crisis is because we don't have enough members, who are educated in our community, because education had been a big issue in our country. Rohingyans were deprived of education in Burma, and it was very hardly accessible for many Rohingyas in living in the country to have proper access to education, and many villages and cities didn't have a school for Rohingyas to go to. Say, like I would say, 80% of them grow up illiterate with no education. So yeah, creating a better educational pathway would also be addressing the humanitarian crisis, and that would help them to have a new generations, educated, who would be able to challenge the system and make a difference for their community. That's another important thing to address the lost generations of Rohingya. So these are some immediate solutions for Rohingya to save them, literally, because a lot of the Rohingyas are now living in Bangladesh, taking their life on hands, getting on a boat, crossing across the oceans to Malaysia, Indonesia, and many other countries, and not everyone is making out.
I would like to ask how different is it in Bangladesh to Malaysia, for example, or Indonesia?
Appropriately enough, our
Is there
last
a
interview with
neighboring country Thailand? I don't know. Is there a neighboring country where it is at least relatively safe there for Rohingya people fleeing Myanmar?
Well, it's not 100% safe for them, even in Indonesia, Malaysia, and all these Asian countries. They are facing different circumstances in this country. But compared to Bangladesh, in this country, in Malaysia, Indonesia, they would be safe. They can believe, I would say they can believe to be safe for some time, or for longer time than Bangladesh, I would say, because their situation in Bangladesh, it's like living, imagine yourself being in a war zone country, where the conflict and genocide is still happening. And you always have this feeling, what would happen tomorrow? What if I get killed? What if a gang came and arrest me and maybe shoot me? It's a situation where there is no protection for them. They are like in an open area where every kind of wild beast or animal can come anytime to attack them. So there is no proper governance system. They are not secure. They don't feel any secure there. Like every day, every night, people are being died, people are being killed, people are being kidnapped, children are being sold out to many different gangs. And Bangladeshi, there are a lot of gangs and a lot of these people, kidnappers, that are using kidnapping Rohingyas, killing, like doing. It's a huge human trafficking now in Bangladesh. And they were also people, like I said, they were also maybe it's all coordinated to finish these people.
So we'll get back to the efforts to get Rohingya refugees to places like Canada and developed countries like after that. But the fact that those people aren't safe either in their own countries or any country surrounding it, on the long term, that's definitely the bigger and more important problem. Are there any efforts at all being made to address that?
Well, there are some, of course, international aid coming to the camp, but the effort are being made are pretty fragile. They are not strong enough to make any changes. Like it's been Rohingya have been there for almost 5 to 7 years, and their situation is only getting worse day by day. So that's mean there has not been enough international aid coming to these places. There has not been people care enough to help them, to protect them until now. That's why they are fleeing. So comparatively, they are somehow safer to if they can make it to, let's say, Malaysia, Indonesia, or any other country except Bangladesh, Thailand, because in this country they are not, the government is not as chaos as Bangladesh. They have a better government system in these countries. They do provide refugee with protection, which is they are not killing the refugee directly the way the Bangladeshis are doing to them. They somehow allowed them to stay temporarily, but the problem there is that they are not recognized for anything. They don't get any documents from the government marking their legal stay in the country. So they are always illegal immigrants, and they somehow get the UNHCR recognition as a refugee, which is refugee status, but it doesn't mean anything. They are not allowed to find a job. They are not allowed to rebuild their life. They are not allowed to have access to educations. They have no privilege of being in that country. So they somehow live as an illegal immigrant. They work in informal job, which nobody would want to do in their country as a citizens, just to survive. They were like doing anything to kind of feed themselves and also send little money to their family, back in Myanmar or back in Bangladesh to help them to
Yeah,
survive.
it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me that a country would give those people refugee status and let them stay, and then kind of obligate them to be economic burdens on the country because they're not really able to participate in the job market and like all of that. And do you have anything to say to that? What might move a state to develop a system like that? Is it just incompetence, or is there an agenda behind it?
Do you think Indonesia and Malaysia are doing what they're doing just because they get foreign aid money for having refugees there?
I'm not sure about Malaysia in particular, but I'm pretty much sure about Indonesia because I've been there for 8 years and I have invested my time learning a lot of things about Indonesian policy, Australian policy, and all these refugee, policies there that are affecting refugees. Indonesia was not also very much welcoming toward refugee because they have this resentment of foreign invader when it came to history of Indonesia. They were sort of like resistance against the foreign invader. So they would consider us as a foreign invader, like, and they are not, like in general, they are not pretty much welcoming to refugees, and they are not pretty much well educated about refugees at the same time. And therefore, the government, like Bangladesh at some point, not in like, it's a different level. Bangladesh is like next level, it's 100% next level. It doesn't fall in human categories. It's pretty inhuman what Bangladesh government is doing to refugees. So there's no comparison with the Bangladeshi government in Indonesia. But at some point, yeah, when it's come to corruption, yes, Indonesia is hugely corrupted in terms of using victims for their interests. So the thing is, when refugees come to Indonesia, they were not coming to Indonesia. They were trying to go to Australia. So the same reason I came to Indonesia. And Australia wanted to stop people coming to Australia by boat. So the only way to do so is to cooperate with Indonesia, because Indonesia is the first place where refugees are taken boat to Australia. So Australia has allocated millions of funds, to millions, even billions. They were researched in 2017 that say Australia has spent millions of money in deterrent policy. So the deterrent policy has been ongoing in Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries. Like Malaysia is also part of this deterrent policy, which means Australia is allocating fund to run the detention center in Malaysia as well. So what happened is that the Australian government would provide as many funds as possible, whatever the government demands, to keep them in detention. And Australia would fund all kind of detention in Indonesia, including government services and organization, which is IUM. IUM stands for International Organization for Migrant, and it is one of the main key pillar of Australian deterrent policy. They are the organizations in Indonesia in place to supply Australian deterrent policy. And Indonesia, the government in general, are also part of this deterrent policy, because Australia pay for every refugee, sort of like paying tax for refugees, to allowing them to stay in Indonesia, because Indonesian government would push Australian government, these people are not here for me, they are coming for you. I'm going to let them go to your country. So then Australia compromised with the situations. Okay, don't let them come here. I will pay you, right? So we were like, Indonesia was selling us to Australia, and all these, Indonesians detentions and facilities are run by Australia. So in a way, yeah, Indonesian government is corrupted, using refugees for their interests. It's a very dirty crimes against humanity, sending victims. Like these are government we're talking about.
I can only imagine how. Yeah, it's just obscene to be investing this amount of money to keep refugees indefinitely detained to protect Australia from them.
Like my concern is, if you don't want a refugee, why the hell you signed the United Nations Convention permission that you would protect refugees?
Yeah, well, there are other reasons for that, but how long can a refugee stay in a detention camp or have to stay there in Indonesia?
So before 2018, there were no sort of a structural timeline for how long a refugee would be detained. There was no any organized structure to.
So theoretically, they could just be held indefinitely?
Yeah, it's like very arbitrary.
Okay.
And they were refugees. When I was in the detention, I saw refugees who has been detained like for 17 years, 10 years, 9 years, and I was like surprised. I was like worried more than surprised about my own situation. So that's when I realized, when I saw this situation, learned about this, what is happening in Indonesia. Like, I was pretty young though. I was 19 years old when I was in Indonesia. And I was just a student, right? I just left. I just left my country because of the conflict. But I happened to be there because I was fall in the trap, in this political trap. That was created by Australia and Indonesia. So for Indonesian, like that was funny. For Indonesian police and security, finding a refugee, coming to Indonesia and trying to take boat to Australia, it's like finding a precious thing for them, because Australia pay them for every single refugee they could capture. So we were like precious stone for them. So they would hunt us from everywhere to collect them and send them to us, like report them to Australia, for the money. So
That's
yes,
absolutely obscene. Yeah.
yeah. So while I was in the detention, I saw this whole situations how refugees are being treated. Even though we were like innocent, we didn't committed any crimes. We were just fleeing from our countries because of conflict and war. They were refugees from different countries, from Afghanistan, from Somalia, from all over the world, and they are all from war and conflict and all this sort of like terrible, affected countries. So they were all refugees, so genuine refugees. And the reason why they were there is not, some of them, intentionally came to Indonesia to just, seek refuge because there is UNHCR office in Indonesia to register as a refugee and live as a refugee in Indonesia. But instead, they were all detained in detention, and capturing them in detention was also part of Australian deterrent policy. And I would further explain that later. But when I saw this situation, when refugees are being detained for many years and there were no certainty and there were no guarantee when they are going to be released, I realized I needed to do something. It's not me, someone has to do something, and most of the refugees were afraid to go against the government, to speak out against the government. Many of them do know how to do so, and some are lack of English, some are lack of writing, some are lack of understanding about the politics, and some even don't know about their human rights and about why they were imprisoned. They believe that they are imprisoned because they committed a crime by coming to this country, and there was a belief they have been instilled by the system, to sort of like brainwash them, from knowing their right, from knowing the truth. So I started educating refugees from the camp about their rights, and that they should fight back for their right, and that they should not be treated this way.
And how did you do that?
How did I do that?
Yeah.
I do what? Sorry.
How did you start to educate other refugees in the camps about their rights and how they can use them?
Well, it's not just educating refugee, but also educating myself, because I was also pretty much lack of skill, lack of knowledge, because I wasn't able to study politics and journalism in my country, which are forbidden subject in my country. You can never touch politics in my country, right? So in order to educate them, I needed to educate myself. So before I do that, I studied, coordinated, like got help somehow to get some books from Indonesia and from my country. And I sort of studied at least 1 year, learning all about the international politics and refugee law and all kind of communication skill. My writing was not as good. I could speak English, but my writing was not as good. And I realized I also needed to improve my writing. So I practiced writing like at least 1 year. Once I was confident that I have learned enough, then I also needed to change my personality, uh, my whole thing, myself, because if I were to approach a different community, I would need to be someone else. I can't be a Muslim. I can't be a Rohingyan. I can't be someone from Myanmar. I had to present myself as a neutral body. I had to learn their culture as well, because I knew that people would believe you, would trust you if you're more likely from their community. So I had to adopt learning about their culture, their some of their languages, so that I can touch their heart to trust me and to fight back. So it was a lot of also building motivations, inspiring them, because I can't do it alone. I have to. Everyone need to unite, So, and the government were also playing their own agenda, in terms of playing divide and rule. They don't want refugee to be united, because they believe that if they are united, they would create, this unite the power of unity and fight against the government. So they didn't want that. So I also had to, like, sort of like cover up the government situation, and it took me at least 1 year educate them on their rights, and that explain. What I did was mostly educating refugees and explaining their right and what's happening, and that they are not, criminal, and that they have the right to seek refuge in different in every countries, because it's everyone's right to to seek safety, after fleeing genocide and war from the country. So this realization took them, sometimes, but eventually they came together and we were able to unite as one voice. And then we sort of like protested against the government, against the, detentions policy, detention rules. We should not be, kept in detention. We are not criminal, and that there is no law that state that refugees should be detained. And we were not against the government. We were not against the system. We were only demanding our, human rights. So, and then at the same time, I also needed to present myself to the Indonesian governments and security, immigration, and most of them were, treating refugees as criminal because they are also lack of, education about refugees. They also don't know about the refugees laws and who are the refugees and stuff. So I sort of like, educate the security and the immigration officer and all those things. So finally, things began to change. We were slowly able to relocate to the IUM accommodations, which is relation from detention center. Yeah, so things changed. Yeah, things slowly began to change, and we were most of them were released. Like all of us were released from the detention. We were relocated to IUM accommodation. But the
What are IUM accommodations?
IOM accommodations means it's not like you are gonna be entirely free. It's like, community housing, like community housing. You are not in detentions, but you are in a community house where you could go out and, go out and walk around the city, but you don't have any human rights. So the government is not gonna give up on refugees that easily. And so here comes the Australian refugee deterrent policy. So the Australia designed the whole situation of refugee in Indonesia in a way to discourage them from pursuing their goal to reach to Australia. And the way they are doing that is by creating, difficult situation for refugees, sort of like making their life as hard as possible so that they can give up and return back to their country, and also explain their situation, inform their situation to the potential asylum seeker who might want to come to Indonesia and take boat to Australia. So Australia use us as a tool, as a policy tool, to mentally and physically prevent Australian border. So they use us as an example, saying that if you come to Indonesia with intention to go to Australia, this would be your life. You're gonna be detained and you're gonna be in limbo forever. You will never be able to come to Australia. So Australia has used us as an example for their deterrent policy, and we were trapped in that Australian deterrent policy as pounds. And there, I realized that when I was relocated to IOM accommodation, when I was in detention, I didn't realize about Australian deterrent policy. The only thing I knew was the government prosecuting refugees, which is illegal. So now that I came to IOM accommodation, now I realize the situation. It was Australia. So I started now advocating, now educating refugees again, on Australian deterrent policy, and then coordinating protests and, writing to international media. And this because when it's come to different country involved in the refugee situation, it was not local anymore. I needed the international attention to address this issue. So I had to train myself to become a journalist, and I did some, online courses, and I did a diploma in journalism online because I wasn't able to go to college and university there. Those are not allowed for refugees. So I kind of like self-trained myself to be a writer and journalist, and place articles in like BBC, Al Jazeera, and many in Australia, like everywhere, to finally raise this awareness and how the Australians' deterrent policy is killing refugees in Indonesia, and also saying that it's not just the Manus and the narrow island that Australia has created detention, but Indonesia is also Australia's deterrent policy, and Indonesian detention are also created by Australia, and we are here trapped and used as pawn by the Australian. So that was the message I was covering in international media while coordinating protests with refugees all across Indonesia. So finally, the policy somehow took place to change, and the detention was removed in 2018, and refugees somehow, like the government somehow prevent themselves from arbitrarily arresting refugees and looting them. There were a lot of situations where immigration would arrest refugees arbitrarily from everywhere, and then they would demand money to be released. And a lot of these things were still like these are still happening, but things somehow began to change a little bit from worse. Like detention were removed, and refugees were not arbitrarily arrested. Like when you were in the IUM accommodation, there were a lot of restriction. Like you would not be able to bring friends over to stay at your room or at your accommodations. You would not be able to visit. Like there were a lot of restrictions. You are not allowed to, engage in any relationship with the local women. Like you can't date any local women. Like if the immigrations found you dating a local woman, they would send you back to detention, and you would be there like who knows, like forever. So there were a lot of the restriction in place in the IUM shelter. So some of them have slowly changed, but the biggest thing that happened was that I was able to grab some Canadian attention on the situations and some other countries. Before 2018, there were no resettlement happening for refugees in Indonesia because every country believed that they were all responsible for Australia because they all came to go to Australia. So Canada, US, and other countries were kind of like distracting themselves from the refugees in Indonesia, even though the situation was getting worse because they thought it's Australia's responsibility and Australia is a giant signatory country and they can handle all the refugees crisis. But they didn't realize that Australia was using these refugees for their own policy too. So the biggest thing I would say I was able to achieve in my protest, in my activism, is that I was able to gain some international attention in terms of resettlement. And after all these protests, I won't say it's not just me though. I can't do it myself. I was able to get help and cooperation from people all over the world, and the refugees themselves were all become a fighter for their rights. They fought for their rights. So the only thing that I would say that I contributed most is letting them know what their right and amplifying their voices. That's what I would say. I would say that I did mostly in terms of contributing to this crisis. So, and then the other good thing would be Canada now are pretty much interested to resettle, sponsor refugees from Indonesia. So over the years, a lot of the more than 200 to 300 refugees are now resettled in Canada through the sponsorship program since then. And we are now still continuously working on the resettlement programs. And the Northern Light Canada has now shifted their focus fully in refugees in Indonesia. So yeah, these are some positive outcomes that happen after our protests. And it's not just the awareness of refugee in Indonesia, but also it's raised the awareness of refugees in Asia in general, because the situation of refugee in Indonesia is pretty similar to almost every Asian countries.
It's great that Canada is taking initiative and taking a lot of those refugees in, but like just for numbers and for logistical reasons, it probably does make more sense for even countries like Australia, which are causing this problem, to be pushed into taking more responsibility, right? So is there any progress being made on that front right now?
Well, Australia has been dealing internally with its own politics in terms of refugee, and they have changed many prime minister based on the refugee policy. But every time a new prime minister came in, they sort of like still stick with the previous refugee policy. I don't know. Australia has their own. It's not just the government, I would say. It's also the people there who might have issue with refugees because Canada is welcoming to refugees. It's because not just the government is welcoming themselves, but also the people. So the government is the representative of the people, right? The government make policy based on the people income, based on the citizen incomes, right? Citizen input, sorry. They
In
have
a
been trying,
democracy, yeah.
they have been trying to change these refugee policies like since 2013. Before 2013, they have a better policy when there was a lady prime minister. She was very humble. She would accept all the refugee coming to Australia and immediately recognize them like permanent residents. And but after she was changed, thing has gotten worse. And every time a new prime minister came in, they just develop the deterrent policy to the worst from. They just keep continuing, and they are even the refugees like those who were able to make to Australia by boat, they are now seeking, refuge in Canada. So Australia is now, it's become one of the Asian country, one of the Indonesia who is detaining refugees within the Australia. There are refugees detained in Australian territory in the hotels, right? And some of them who were living in community, they are not provided with any sort of legal documents. They are like on sort of temporary visa, and they have no future certainty in the country. So they most of them are now seeking refuge in Canada now. So Australia, I would say, is no longer a refugee protective country. It has changed itself from being a country of against refugee. Australia is not a refugee country anymore. It's become one of the non-signatory country that does not provide protection to refugees because the internal refugee that have been living there for many years are now seeking refuge in other country from Australia. So yeah, Australia no longer stand in a positions of humanity, and I would not consider Australia to be a humanitarian country providing humanitarian protection to refugees. Australia has killed many refugees in Indonesia and in many countries by their deterrent policy, by their this destructive refugee policy. And so I have witnessed a lot of the refugees committed suicide in Indonesia and died from lack of healthcare, suffering from mental disaster, for mental health issue. So Australia is responsible for all these innocent refugees that were died in Indonesia for their destructive policy, and that was designed to sacrifice most of these refugees for their own policy agenda to serve an example for refugees coming to seek refuge in Australia. So Australia no longer stands as a humanitarian country.
Yeah, so I do hope that with more documentation and talking about those issues and giving more details about the situations that those refugees are in can change this, if even gradually.
Well, there is
But we'll see what develops in Australia in the
a
future, right?
we created a documentary on this whole spectrum of Australian deterrent policy. You can watch it. It's available. It's called Freedom Street.
Yeah, maybe we should put a link to that in our notes.
Like it's pretty unexpected. A country of highly educated people showing this different face to the world.
Yeah, well, like Steven said in our last interview, their media is dominated by Murdoch. Although with any luck, they'll be gone soon. They're about to get sued for over $1 billion because they not only lied, they told each other they were lying, and now the text messages and emails to each other have been released as public knowledge, but that's neither here nor there.
Australia could have, better allocate all these billions of money they spend, on detaining, killing refugees, to be a leader in Asian countries. Like this was always at the back of my head, like, why would only Western country need to be the one to resolve refugee humanitarian crisis? There are now a lot of very well developing country in Asia, like for example, Malaysia and Singapore. India is also, on the other hand, a pretty well developing country. And almost all the like country in Asia are now pretty much developed. It's not like 100 years ago where the country is still suffering from poverty and low income things. Indonesia is also one of the most developed country in Asia.
Yeah.
So Australia could have been the leader of educating these countries to contribute to humanitarian crisis, to refugee crisis. Like if comparing to refugee populations in Europe and other countries, Asia has very tiny number of refugees, maybe let's say around 2 to 3 million refugees all over Asia. It's not a lot compared to refugees in Europe. They are how many, like 8 million, you know, 7 to 8 million refugee populations right now all over the world. I think it's gonna be like less than a million refugee population in Indonesia, like in Asian country. So in
Yeah.
Indonesia, there are about 10,000 refugees, which is nothing compared to the refugees in other country, right? If Australia were able to sort of educate and be, and create a lot of diplomacy on this project to kind of educating locals and creating this communication branch, like what I did with the refugees to kind of educate them to fight for their right. But Australia could have done the same, with the local community, create some educational activities, communication channel between refugees and locals, and that way they would have better understanding and local would be more acceptance. Like this, positive diplomacy, would help to create solution for refugees, and the refugee would not need to go to Australia. They would have find a home in these countries, and they are needed to have a better communication channel between refugees and local, and nobody has done that. So Australia could have been the leader of initiating all this project in this country and converting all this Asian country to be a part of the global refugee crisis and contributing toward it, right? So human beings eventually change their mind if they have enough understanding about situation, if they get an opportunity to do something. So I would say Asian countries were never been given an opportunity to be a part of this crisis, but and the citizens never had an opportunity to learn about the refugees properly. That's why we kind of created this archipelago magazine. Our intention is to create this awareness and educate the local, interact locals and the refugees. That's why the situation in Indonesia is now much more better than the situation in Malaysia, where the locals still are harassing refugees, on daily basis. In Indonesia, it's not happening anymore because locals have now a way to engage in conversation with refugees. So in our magazines, a lot of the Indonesians are now writing about refugees, educating themselves. So these are like one of the tools that we created. And Australia, as a giant country, would have done much more better, a lot of the things to educate the peoples in Asia and be as like they would not have to spend this much money that they have spent in deterrent, in negative policy.
Could you please elaborate on the idea behind the Archipelago magazine and how it works, how it reaches people?
So the Archipelago magazine, I would say, is not like a big magazine. It does. We didn't intend it to create a huge magazine or anything. Our intention was to create a channel between refugees and Indonesian, and the best way is to allow them to share their opinions. So we created that magazine not only to create this communication channel between refugees and Indonesian, but also to provide refugee with a platform where they can share their stories. where they can get trained to become a writers and publish their stories, not just in Archipelago, but also in other media, international media. So as a journalist and activist, that was my intention, to train refugees to become writers and publish their story, because the
So
more,
basically about giving refugees a voice.
yeah, so what I thought is that the more they are refugee writers, the more there would be, international attention. So on the other hand, the archipelago's main purpose was to create this communication channel between refugees and the local. So when a local come to the magazine and they read the refugee story and they understand who they are, it's sort of like indirectly educating the locals, and then they engage in refugee policy, engage in refugee discussion, and then they write about what the government now is doing is not right against the refugee. We were told the refugees are criminal. They are criminal fleeing from their country because they committed crime in their country and they ran away from being punished from this crime. So they were told different stories. The government is always propagating against refugees. And now they have a platform where they can listen to refugees directly. So that's why I have observed the situation over the years. It has been now, like say, almost 5 years that we have established the archipelago. And since then, we have seen a lot of the changes within the Indonesian community. Like before, there were a lot of ongoing propagandas against refugees, and now Indonesians are well educated at some point to not to buy what the government are saying, but to listen to refugees. And now they are not refugees are not like they don't face harassment as much as in other country from the locals, and the local are now slowly getting engaged as an advocate for it in some local right now, contribute to refugee crisis in Indonesia.
Yeah, and it's probably worth mentioning somebody we volunteer with is from Indonesia, and before he started volunteering with us, he had no idea that there was any sort of refugee situation in
See?
Indonesia at all.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
the reality. I realized that when I discussed with the locals, do you know who are the refugees? We don't know. They're criminal. They are illegal immigrants. So in their country, they would in their language they would say legal immigrants means illegal immigrants means someone like criminal who entered our country. They could be terrorists. They could be anything. They have no idea.
Not even that. He just had no idea there was any sort of refugee network or UN centers in Indonesia. It's a completely foreign concept to him.
Yeah.
Conversely, our last episode before we interviewed you and Stephen was with someone from Malaysia who had to flee Malaysia.
Uh,
So, yeah.
and now the situation in Malaysia is pretty worse because like I said, is the government somehow brainwash the citizens because there is no platform for like we did in Indonesia. So Malaysia, there is no like for refugees, there is hardly any platform where refugee can like there's any sort of lack of advocacy for refugees in Malaysia right now. And because of that, you can read the news on internet how the citizens are now harassing refugees in Malaysia. So it's becoming a big problems for refugees in Malaysia now. Not just the government, but also the citizens are now persecuting refugees in Malaysia.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's important. Advocacy and educational tool. These are important. That's what I was concerned about the Australia. Australia could have done a better job creating all this channel, all this tool for refugees and the citizens. And eventually, education changed people perspective. Like by now, refugee would have in a better situation than now. If they were more enough, they were more of this kind of educational tool.
Is the Archipelago magazine active in other countries or even accessible, or is it only in Indonesia? How can people reach it?
Now accessible to all kind of countries. We're trying to do the same thing with the like we did in Indonesia for other country as well. Like we're also kind of like trying to create this branch in Malaysia as well, because this archipelago is kind of the home for refugees, because most media would kind of cover refugee stories as long as it's not compromising their interest, their relationship with governments, with the agencies. But archipelago doesn't care about that. Archipelago is for refugees, and they would not compromise their voice. they would maintain their voice as it is, and would provide this platform for all kind of refugees. So that's a good thing about Archipelago. That's why we have been able to amplify the refugee voices, and it's now available everywhere. Everyone can submit their stories, but it's still thriving from the ground, and it needs support from everyone's, and it's also a way for some refugees writers to survive where they cannot find any job. So we kind of allocate some funds to the writers whenever they submit their stories, because most of these countries, they don't have a job to survive. So it's also a way for them to survive with their writing. And yeah, it's available everywhere. And now we are doing this same thing in Canada with the Women's in Flight. And it's also like we are now, profiling the the people that are contributing to refugee crisis. It's sort of like educating people to contribute more on refugee crisis, because there has not been enough, solution to resolve the refugee crisis. Refugees are still in the same situation as 100 years ago. There is no still like proper solution, like, to resolve the refugee crisis. Refugees are still suffering, not just in Indonesia, everywhere, almost every country. Refugees have no human rights. Refugees are detained. Refugees are placed in camp where no human being would live. Refugees are deprived of, health care and all kind of, human right. So which means refugee situation is still the same as 100 years ago. There's hardly any improvement. Well, people donate, but that donation doesn't resolve the whole situation, and yeah, it's pretty compromised donation. I would say all the humanitarians coming to refugees, these are all compromised based on their own interests. So, yeah, it's people are self-centered in many ways, and it's a pretty hard situation. So that's why we
No,
need
you can
to.
definitely not depend on charity like as a long-term sustainable solution to this problem. It needs to be something organized by like on a large scale by states, right?
Yeah, the point is we cannot rely on the system, like existing system, to resolve the refugee crisis. If they were able to fix the situation, they would have done this long time ago. And it's not a new situation. It's not an emergent situation. Refugees have been there, like ever since the human generations, evolve into human beings. So it's a so they are not capable of resolving this crisis. So we need the general citizen to be a part of this, crisis, and contribute to this crisis and become change maker. It's the change would this permanent solution would happen if the citizens are willing to change, to be a part of this, refugees crisis. So the reason why we have not achieved any, you know, permanent solution yet is because most people are now are not involved in contributing to refugee crisis, and they don't have enough information and to know what to do. And the government are not most government are not providing this platform for citizens to incorporate and actively, participate in refugee making decisions. And refugees are also deprived in many, decision making process. And most of the decisions that are being made, for refugees are based on their governmental policies and international interests, so which is not fully covering the refugee situation. Yeah, citizens need to get involved. Citizens need to step in the system. Only then there would be a, proper solution for refugees. Otherwise, it's gonna just keep going this way, and refugees would remain
Yeah,
this.
yeah, I agree. I mean, every citizen should be an advocate for refugees because, like, if you're not in a situation where you're being threatened yourself, then you're in a safe position where you would be seeing people either having to suffer unnecessarily or having to be persecuted in your country, in your neighborhood, in your city, right? And it in either situation, I mean,
Like,
as a human being who wants to live in a peaceful society where people get what they need, you need to be an advocate for refugees, that they have their most basic human rights, that the same rights that you enjoy in your own home country,
yeah,
whoever you are.
like I would be the perfect example for people action, you know. So when I was a refugee in Indonesia, I registered with the UNHCR. I had the UNHCR refugee card. But what did it mean? Nothing. I was still detained. I was still harassed by the government. I was still facing human rights deprivation. Nothing. My future was uncertain. I was just given a card. I feel like it means nothing, like zero. It has no law enforcement at all. I was still a subject of victim of the governments in Indonesia. So if it wasn't for Canadian general citizen, I don't know what would happen to my life in Indonesia, you know. So being an activist and journalist in this country is not as easy as in Canada. It's risks in your life, many like every day. And I would receive many threats coming from police and immigration. I couldn't stay in my home. I had to like stay hiding all the time. I had to, run from city to city, from place to place, and I got arrested a few times.
Because
Like,
what, they wanted to deport you back to Myanmar, or?
yeah, like they want me to stop writing. They want me to stop, all this movement of refugees in Indonesia, and we sort of like, it was not as easy as I say it here. It's a big process. It's a very long process. We sort of conducted the protests all over Indonesia, and it was important to do so, get the people to raise the awareness. So, yeah, if it wasn't for Canadian who privately sponsored me to Canada, I would have, I really don't know what would happen to my life by now. I would have been maybe in detention forever, in prison for, or maybe disappeared, or maybe, I don't know. I was like in a pretty unclear situations by 2021. I coordinated the protests all over Indonesia, and published a lot of pieces in BBC and Al Jazeera and everywhere else, and interviewed and stuff. Yeah, so things were very effective in 2012, in 2020. Yeah. So it was Canadian who saved me, literally, like not the government. I would say I didn't came through the government, assisted program. The citizen brought me here with their own contribution, with their own money, with their own, donations.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's
So,
amazing that Canada has that system. If only more countries did.
mhm. And they literally saved my life, and now they are saving a lot of people's life, like me, from Indonesia and from different countries. That's why I said citizen power are more powerful than the government. Government is buying with some policy and law that is not like, that is based on, capitalism, based on their own self-interest, mostly national interests. But once a citizen step in, it's make the whole dynamic into different level.
So we talked about Northern Lights and ways to help refugees from Canada, the private sponsorship system, how refugees can get in contact, all of that in our previous interview with Stephen Watt. And yeah, I think, I don't know if you have anything to elaborate on that, either of you.
Yeah, I would say, of course, it's a very, like, if you are someone looking for a way to make a difference in someone's life, save a refugee from any country, this is a great way to save someone. The government in Canada has provided you this opportunity to save someone's life. So Northern Light Canada, and there are also many other organizations that are, allocating this help for you. If you're out there looking for to help refugees, I would say at least at least sponsor a refugee who are in need of help, and refugees are suffering all over the world. Your little contribution would give them a new life, a new life to live, a second chance to live, in Canada. So like myself, you might have listened my whole story. Like I said, if it wasn't for private sponsorship in Canada, I would not have survived. I don't know what would happen in my life. I would probably say, like, I would not have been alive until today. Like, I was risking my life everywhere. I was pretty much well into also. Like, I calculated that would happen when I chose to be an activist, a journalist, and I needed, and I thought someone need to sacrifice. But I'm lucky that the Canadian give me a second chance to live, and now I'm like contributing to Canadians, in my best potential that I can. So every a refugee is an asset toward Canadian economy, toward Canadians' better policy, and the good thing about this private sponsorship is that you can choose who you want to sponsor, right? And you can choose the best person you want to sponsor and the people that are in need of help. So I would say this is definitely like the best option for someone who's looking to contribute to the global refugee crisis.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, John. Where can people find your work, Archipelago? I don't know where else. You mentioned a number of other outlets where you
Well,
write. Yeah,
I'm
Twitter, all of that.
I'm recently involved in many advocacy platforms. One of them is the Archipelago. I was one of the co-founder there, and now I have co-founded another magazine that's called. It's a project. Still a website. It's not magazine yet. It's a website, I would say. It's called Women's in Flight. Women's in Flight, and I'm also a member of the Northern Light Canada. I do the advocacy tool, and the other thing is I do writings. I publish articles in Canadian media. I have article in CBC, and I'm still continuously writing. So my name would be on internet is J and Junaid or John Junaid. So I use two different names, and I had to use J and Junaid when I was in Indonesia to kind of save myself. And now I am using my real name, which is John Junaid. So yeah, that would be my name if you are googling. Yeah.
All right,
Thank
we'll
you
get
very
all that.
much.
And I'm also available on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, everywhere.
All right. And yeah, thank you very much for interviewing with us. To all of our listeners, thank you for listening. Unless Zach has something else he'd like to say, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.
You too, man. Thank you for giving me
Yeah.
to
Good night,
share.
everyone. We'll get the links to everything that John has been talking about in the show notes here. Thank you for listening, and have a great day or a good night. Bye.
Bye.